Hey, John Strohmeyer here with Five-Star Counsel. Lost a star, that's crazy. But yeah, back again with Five-Star Counsel. This week, we are talking about setting the standard. Why? We know what culture is, we know what our values are, but how do we know if our culture is actually delivering on our values? So what we want to get to is making sure that our values and our standards can be measured so that we know what we're doing. So today we're going to be talking all about how do we set standards, reminding what does it look like to set those standards, and really know if we're done in a way that gets what we're looking for to be done. So this week, setting standard. Next week, we're going to have Maddie Martin on to talk about increasing the speed to getting to the expert. And then a few weeks, we're going to be talking about interviewing, hiring, and onboarding. But this week, we're talking about setting the standards. Again, as our review, service is how easily a business delivers its product. We're not worried about those red herring products that clients didn't ask for. So the drink menu, the omelet menu, other things that we think are improving the client experience, and they may be improving the client experience. But ultimately, clients don't care because as lawyers and professional service providers, clients don't pay us for that experience, for that wonderful, entertaining experience. They're paying us to move the needle. And so we need to make sure that we're keeping everything in check. Sure, it's nice to have wonderful offices, but clients aren't paying you to have nice offices. Clients are paying you to move the needle for them. And so going forward, we're thinking about service as a combination of our high tech and high touch, but it isn't going to be high stuff. We're going to, we've had prior episodes with Paul Cortman and others thinking about how we can use technology to speed up the delivery and make it easier and more consistent. High touch, the service that we want to make sure that it is actually an enjoyable experience for clients. But ultimately, it's a combination of those, and it's not just showering people with things they could go out and buy themselves. We're not a procurement agent for our clients. We talked about in the past business model, which is how a company chooses to make money, versus the business framework, which is how that company is going to specifically implement the business model. Now, the business model is going to be unique to each business, whether they're doing running hotel rooms, they're selling things, or performing legal services. Those business models will be different for each business. The framework is going to be the common elements of every business: marketing and sales, the product, and the administration. And throughout all of this, we need to know how things work so that we can measure and say, well, when we're dealing with clients, when we've had a marketing interaction, did we do that correctly? We need to just say the behavior that was exhibited and it contributes to culture. Is that consistent with our values? Because if we're going to set these high values and we're going to aim our firm vision for having a higher level of client service delivery, then we're going to need to know if we hit it or not. And sometimes we're going to be faced with easy things like, we did this within the time frame we promised. That's easy. Did we do what we said we were going to do? Other times, we're going to have things that are harder to measure. Were we nice to the client? Did we make it easy for them? And we're not always going to be able to measure them, but we can try and approximate something or find the behavior that shows that if we did this behavior, that behavior is indicative of us dealing correctly and really delivering on our values. Why? Well, we also want to make it easy. Owners need to know if they're employees, and that includes owners who are acting as employees, wearing two hats. So not only owning the business, but working in the business. The employees need to know when they're doing the right thing. And one of the problems that I've seen with, firms that I've been at, as well as hearing from other friends who've worked at other law firms, is we get almost no feedback. We don't know what that standard is, but we're told we're told a lower standard of, if I don't tell you anything's wrong, you're doing just fine. Well, for high achievers, we've got something that's called imposter syndrome that kicks in, that we're just waiting for somebody to tap us on the shoulder and say, we figured you out and it's now time for you to go. And while that may not be true in most firms, we have to have some way of knowing, is this the right thing? Have you done the right thing? How do you even know? because sometimes you'll get something back that's, I've had many times where I've turned something in and get it back covered in red ink. And I don't know, is this part of the learning experience? Is this, well, the partner had a certain idea in mind, and once they've said it, seen it actually rendered into black and white on paper, it just didn't work the same way they were looking for. You just don't know sometimes. And knowing that the standards are some way of guiding, this is what you should be doing, this is how you should behave, that is going to help guide things. One of the big things we want these standards for is that it's going to help take the sting out of certain things where we can't adequately measure. You can't ever get in somebody's head and say, I know what you're thinking, or you did this because. We don't want to get in that argument, because it's very easy for the other person to say, no, that's not what I meant. We want to deal with the actual realities of what they've done and how they've delivered. Because if you say, well, you were mean to that person. Well, no, I wasn't. But that's going to just incite an argument between the two of you. But if you can reduce it to, when you were talking to that person, even though they were on the phone, you weren't smiling. We have a standard that we want to make sure that we're taking care of everyone. If our values are that we're warm and empathetic and friendly to people, that's kind of squishy, and we don't know how to measure warm and friendly and empathetic. But if we can set as our cultural standard, every interaction starts with a smile, it's a lot easier for us to say, well, during the course of that interaction, you just didn't even start with a smile. You were frowning the entire time. The client couldn't have known that you were trying to be friendly, or that you were doing your best to meet them where they were. And so it's a lot easier to say, please work on your smiling when you're dealing with people. Not only when they can see you, when they're right in front of you, whether it's in person or on a Zoom meeting, but also on the phone. That smile does carry through. So setting the standard that we want to make sure that you are acting this way. We can say, did you do it? Yes or no. Making it black and white, not 75% smiling, not 25% smiling, but you were smiling, so that we know this is what we need to work on. If we can make it that easy, and then giving that feedback to the employee of, look, when you behave this way, this is what happens. And you're not living up to our values and culture when you're not behaving in a certain way. So ultimately, we're using these standards as a way of measuring that our actions, which create our culture, meet up with our values. We've talked before about the standards for the Four Seasons, for Disney, for the Ritz-Carlton, and even in my own law firm, how it's conveying this is what we're doing and this is how we're going to do things. And how most firms don't have any of these standard values, I'm mixing terms. Most firms haven't set any values, so they don't know what they're doing when it comes to creating a culture. And that culture ends up reducing down to the lowest common denominator, where if all we're valuing is billing hours and respecting authority, well, it gets you compliance and it gets you making money, but is that all we really want to be doing for people? If we can't separate what we're doing and how we're doing it, that part of the business model, from why we're doing it, the values that we have that aren't just do great legal work, it's going to be hard to create anything other than really toxic environment that people may not want to be at. But if you can say, look, these are our values, this is what you've committed to when you signed up to work here, this is what we committed to when we agreed to bring you on, it helps bring out what people are looking for and what makes it easier to be there. So when we think about it, it really is, how are we going to measure if we're meeting these values? And it brings me back to an example I've given a lot of. One of the phone standards at the Four Seasons was always, if somebody calls, one, we're going to answer within 3 rings, but we're also going to use their name 3 times within that call. And what that does is it ensures that we are recognizing that person, that they can hear their name, that we know who they are. And it's one of those things that we just make sure that they feel welcomed when we're on the phone with them. And so that was the standard. You just had it drilled into you, again and again, that the standard went on a phone call using their name 3 times. So once at the beginning, once at the end, and once sometime in the middle, because you're not getting that face-to-face interaction on the phone, but you can make sure that you are conveying to them that they are recognized and you are paying attention to them. Another way to think about it was, as the night manager, every Wednesday morning, one of the last things I did before leaving from that first shift of the week on Tuesday night, usually Wednesday at 8:30 in the morning, we had the hotel walkthrough with the overnight cleaners and the hotel manager. And this would be, we'd walk through the areas that the night cleaners were responsible for. They'd come in, we'd be looking at, the public-facing restrooms, the health club, all the areas that they were responsible for keeping clean and cleaning up during the overnight. And so these were areas that couldn't clean during the day, but Wednesday mornings were generally a lower traffic time. So it was easy for us to have the 5 or 6 folks walking through, kind of making notes on what to see, what we were seeing. And there was one time I remember we were walking through one of the restrooms, and I was pointing out things that I thought I was being really on the ball. And I was pointing out some cleaning that hadn't been done, but it was in an area of the restroom, high above the mirrors, where I could see that things weren't getting cleaned as well. And the hotel manager said, turned to me and said, "Well, that's good and that's important that we're noticing that, but how many of our guests actually pay attention to what's up there?" So it's not only what do we see as the fine-tune, minute details, but checking to see when the guest was in the restroom, are they checking up there? Or is it actually, we need to go into each stall and check and see what does it look like? Not the cursory, open the door and look through and see, is everything fine? But go in, turn around, close the door to the stall, and make sure what is the guest seeing, so that our standards, which were, we want things to be clean, we're making sure that we're rooting out and actually getting to the important part of that standard. It's not just that things are clean, but how can we make sure that when we implement this standard of cleanliness throughout the hotel, that we've got a way that we can measure it. So it's 2 parts, knowing where we're going, and then setting that standard so that we can know when we're measuring it, are we actually living up to this? So there are a lot of things in there. We'll spend the last few minutes here just thinking about, well, what are the common interactions that clients are going to have with lawyers? And we'll start first with, just email. When we email clients or anybody, making sure that we don't have one version of ways of behaving that we're going to apply across the board. We want to make sure, well, in email, what does it look like? Making sure that we're sending out professionally delivered and produced emails. That means we're going to want to make sure that, we've got in Outlook spell check on, so that it's taking care of things. And, we're going to miss some of that spelling. We want to make sure that we've got that taken care of in a way that clients don't even have to think about it. We want them to think about just the sheer brilliance that we've reviewed them. So whether you've got a standard of, we're going to have the most legalese, dense form language, or we're going to be more casual, we'll use contractions, knowing that you're going to have to define that for your employees so they know what's happening. Knowing that they are then going to be held to the standard of, well, we send more formalized emails. The text should be written this way, and just taking that decision off their plate. Because once you set that standard and they know what to aim for, through repetition, they're going to start learning exactly what that looks like and how they need to behave. And that's what we want, is when they repeatedly behave, that's building the culture of, we send, emails that contractions are allowed because we're not going to be hyper formal, or we're going to be hyper formal. We're going to have these settings set and these standards met, and we're going to try and make it easy for the employees to follow up on each time. We've talked about phones already and how we want to make sure that we're getting name usage and answering quickly. The next time we talk with Maddie Martin, she's with Smith AI. And when they're coming in and answering the phones, it's ensuring that people get answered quickly and they're answered according to a script so that we're getting the right information out every time, getting that consistent behavior so that the culture is consistently high. When we think about meetings, when we come back to not only just meeting in person, but even meetings on Zoom, how are those going to behave? How should people behave? How should they be dressed? Thinking about what is that minimum standard, writing it down and then communicating it. Because it's one thing for it to just be all in your head. But if you're not conveying that onto your employees, how are they going to know? So these can't be the hidden standards that aren't ever shared. You've got to not only figure out what they are, and then figure out how to convey them so people aren't surprised when you say, hey, when you wrote that email, there are a bunch of misspellings in it. You didn't do this search for it. I need you to work on that. It's not a surprise for them to hear that something like that is being implemented. So there are lots of ways that we can think about this, but ultimately, we're figuring out how do we bridge the gap between the airy-fairy of our values and the culture, which is actually going to be how we live day to day and what we're doing in our firms. The standards that we set and making sure that we follow those standards. That's how we're going to do it. Letting people know when we're doing these activities, this is how we're looking for you to behave. We want to make sure that you're behaving in this way, and when you behave that right way, that's how we're going to deliver for our clients in the way that we want to. If you don't hit that mark, doesn't mean we're throwing you right out, but it does mean that we need to start thinking about how do we make sure that this works for you, and how do we make sure that you know that you've done the job that we need you to do. So that's all we've got for today. Thanks so much for listening. I've been John Strohmeyer with 5 Star Counsel. We'll see you next time.